Just touch base with folks. It's really about building community, right? The work that we're doing right now is connecting the dots. And so I know I was inspired by the one check-in I had about building community and the intersectionality of the issues that we all face and work on. So glad we were able to do that. So we're going to come back to another presentation. I'm actually going to have our esteemed presenter. I like saying words like that to get people all nervous and stuff like that, so they got to step up to the plate. But Lauren Jacobs, Deputy Director of the Partnerships for Working Family. She has been an organizer for 20 years. She began organizing factories with Unite in the South and later joined the staff of the SEIU. So I'm just going to stop there. Lauren has an amazing bio, but beautiful to have you. Lauren, I'm going to put your slide up.
Great. Good evening, everybody. Can everybody hear me? Yeah. Awesome. So I was a little bit, thinking about, well, how do I open given the weekend that we all just had, and actually asked my colleagues, should I really be my full authentic self? And as is our practice internally, they were like, yes. And so I can't say that I don't sit here thinking about that. It was Friday evening as I was sitting in the airport flying back from Milwaukee that I learned about the verdict in the Yanez trial, and that the blow that was dealt Philando Castile and the entire St. Paul, Minneapolis community, and all of us nationally. And this morning that I heard the news about Nabra and Charlena. And I want to just open up and say I really am filled with a very fierce and sense of urgency, because this work is about so much more than a raise or rent stabilization. All those are important, but they're slices. This work is really about who belongs and who is part of that we, the people. So I'm hoping to urge all of us to be as bold and courageous as we can be, and then some more, because so many lives depend on this. So let me get us started and start out localizing, talking. I live in Boston, but much of what's been happening here in Pittsburgh, I grew up in New York City. I've lived a lot of cities, and much of what's happening here in Pittsburgh I've seen before. Many of the people here from out of town are going to be like, oh yeah, I know this, I know how this goes. And so, Pittsburgh today, after years, after seeing steel mills close, loss of many manufacturing jobs, a lot of disinvestment, the growth of poverty in the city, is now sort of a center of a lot of acclaim for being the new Pittsburgh, where lots of investment is happening, the boom times are booming, and probably, ne'er a week goes by that we don't hear about the eds and meds economy and how high tech is, bringing the Steel City back, and that there is the newest hot neighborhood with, I know this, like the cafes and the people walking around in the parks and all the things that, because, this is a story in every city, or many cities. And that's, you're right, it's not anecdotal, it does merit national trends. But when we go a little deeper, we know that growth, those boom times, are not booming for everyone. And that we are seeing that instead of many of the residents of the cities, be they low income, be they middle income, are actually having their lives made more precarious as a result of these booms and as a result in the increase in displacement. And I want to center this in us really thinking about this and what this means. So these are for families. Here in this city, many of whom are African American, love their neighborhoods, love their communities, believed in this town before Uber did and before UPMC did, and before all the new sort of folks are coming, are now having that faith and that investment of their time with their families in their neighborhoods, their years of work in the city, being repaid with them being forced to leave communities where they may have been for generations. And it's one of my biggest pet peeves that we often talk about this as though it's like a natural occurrence, like it's a tornado, right? Like it's just unfortunate that, the boom times are coming and some people are just getting pushed out. That's not what's happening. This is a result of decisions and choices that people are making, and it's a result of a lack of will by some to center values and morality. And that is to really say that we will invest in having an inclusive city, that we will have a city in which there are no boom times unless it's booming for everyone. And that is really sort of the tension here. And I think it is the challenge that all of us here need to rise to, organizers, funders, advocacy leaders, civic leaders, be however we identify. All of us are here today because we care about this picture and care about this divide and bridging it, or actually ending that such a divide could even exist. And so the challenge is how do we get there? So what brings this about? I'm just going to quickly go through this because I think many of you know the story. Here in Pittsburgh, like a lot of other places, wages have stagnated, right? So if you look over this 6-year period here, ne'er a rise, that gray line, that's Pittsburgh. I don't even want to, like you can see the red and the dotted blue one, that's blue one is Pennsylvania, the red one is the United States. That's actually a crash. Here they stabilized, but how many people have seen like rents haven't risen? Folks drive cars, they've seen gas go up, food prices go up. So what that actually means, that flat line actually means families are actually losing their purchasing power and actually losing out. And then you combine that with a housing boom that has seen rents in those very dark areas rise as much as 45%. So now let's imagine that. No raise and your rent's almost doubling. We know what the results of that are going to be. And this is not just this is a racialized problem. Just to be straight, that disproportionate to the numbers of the population here, right? African Americans and Latinos are experiencing this type of displacement and rise in the precarity of their living situation at a much faster rate than white residents of the city. So, how do we rise to this challenge? How do we deal with it? So I think actually the answer lies in looking at what it looks like when we do our work normally, right? So let's just say, I think many of us here have been in fights where we've tried to raise minimum wage, or we've introduced rent stabilization, or even actually I could map this and say this is kind of what happened when New York City had the audacity to say, maybe we don't need to sell people 72-ounce big sodas. If you want that much, you could buy 2, right? Right. So this sort of same thing happens. We have sort of what I think of as a 4-ring circus, right? We have usually a local politician that comes out and says, I don't know about the viability of the proposals and, will it be good for business? And then we have normally a think tank industry type expert that comes out and is we've done studies and it will crash the economy. The earth will split open and, and the seas will rise and cover and everything will go bad. And then we have the community organizations that pop up and seem to have none of the funding challenges that any of us do. And they're off and running and all these people are showing up. And then we always have the proverbial small business owner, right? That's oh my God, if this happens, if rent goes up, or if you stabilize rent, my building's gonna end, nobody will rent anymore, or I won't be able to make any business, or if wages go up, I'm never gonna sell another hamburger. That round always happens, right? Does this look familiar to folks? Yeah. Okay. The issue is that oftentimes we sometimes get stuck in sort of chasing one of these, right? And some of this the urgency of we're trying to move, we're trying to get it done, we need to confront whoever's sort of the loudest voice. But if we dig a little deeper, oftentimes we find bigger actors in the background. Who's funding the think tanks? Who's donating to politicians that are constantly on the opposite side of, making a more equitable distribution in our cities? Who are the business owners part of a larger association, right? That's got bigger players in it. And I think in that locus is where we can actually start to think a little bit about how do we start tackling these issues at their root core and actually think about how do we start winning across issue areas. And so I want to talk about this and say, it's not just any corporation, right? This is not like sort of the corporations of the 50s I know somebody's going to come out with like the labor history buffs are going to be like, that's not quite accurate, but bear with me. These companies aren't like the Carnegies, where they lived here. There was a reputational cost to behaving in a certain way. Well, kind of. I know Homestead, yes. But people were here, right? We now have in the transformation of capital from an industrial model that was based on a specific business rooted in a specific place with a specific family or owner to a more financial model that you now have shareholders. So instead of one boss, 1,000 bosses, right? Scattered throughout, right? That we have a different sort of look at what is the long-term growth of a company or the importance of a company to short-term growth and dividend booms versus the long-term stability, because people look at these investments as much more short-term in and outs. And for those that are skeptical, I will say this, it really shows up in GDP, right? The fire industry, finance, insurance, real estate, leasing, forget it, messes up my little initial thing, fire, but it is 20% of GDP. So this is like the biggest part of our economy now. It's not manufacturing. It's not all these other things that we once thought of as the big industries. This is that thing where we talk about we're not making things. We're sort of swapping money and debt around. This is it. This is what it looks like. And that has real life consequences and how we get to sort of the housing and wage struggles that we have. So I do want to say, I want to take us through just quickly some of the industries that are big here and some of the new ones nationally that sort of people talk about and say, well, it's different. I actually worked in Silicon Valley for a while, and there are I would say, and I was with the janitors union at the time, and our members actually were very happy to be on the Google campus, and I will not, because it paid a little bit better. There was free snacks, and so there are some things that are different. However, in terms of how these companies interact with the economy, we see the influence of the financial services sector on how the behavior is. So let's just pick this apart. So you have things that we wouldn't normally think about as being monetized, now monetized. So what I mean by this is how many people have Facebook accounts and now like things and love things, and all that's being tracked and sold so that Facebook has better advertising revenue. Disruption is now a new buzzword. It really is sort of code for ending employment obligations in an industry. So we sort of see that with Uber, but we're also starting to see that now with translators. There was just a radio story I was listening to that you have businesses now talking about, we're disrupting translating because we can just pull down, but what it really is taking the aggregate labor of several individuals and making and sort of releasing, getting rid of the obligation to pay people for those services. Keeping money in offshore banks, in offshore accounts, and share buybacks are a very common feature in the tech industry. And even just the app-based economy is based on very short-term, what can we mine and what can we make money on right now. So eds and meds are nonprofits. Just to understand, university endowments, there's about $500 billion in endowments in the United States. $100 billion, 20% of that is managed by hedge funds. Sometimes these players in the financial industry are trustees of universities, but even for the ones that aren't, many of these endowments are investment funds that invest in all sorts of real estate and corporations and others, as well as Universities in many towns and cities are major landlords. They're also driving how housing has become a commodity. Student debt is a lucrative business for many banks, and that becomes an entryway, as well as consumer debt. I will speak up, I will confess, I was one of these young people that unfortunately got their hand on a credit card at 18. It was the worst thing that ever happened. But that becomes an avenue of revenue for sources here. And I think understanding debt is really critical, because it's just understanding how debt is, you can't talk about cities or towns and what is happening to them without talking about how debt's being leveraged. And we see that both in how it affects regular residents from the growth of the payday lending industry. So because people do not make good wages or wages that can support their families, we now have a whole industry that's grown up around, we can get rich off of the fact that, company X or restaurant X is not going to pay people what it should for the work that they put in. Debit cards for payroll are another thing. I've witnessed this myself of seeing workers having, that it's not debt in that way, but when people go to use it in certain places, they're getting dinged and sometimes end up with negative account balances on their cards. So constant perpetual debt. Consumer debt, we've already talked about. Subprime mortgages, we know how that went, I'm sure. I don't need to do a primer for this room on that. And then it actually transfers into our government functions. Public authorities taking on debt, and municipal debt, which I think the city knows very much about in terms of how it precipitated the water crisis that is currently facing the city, which I'll get to. Sorry, wrong button. So although I know that Pittsburgh maybe in comparison to some other cities, the next area I want to quickly sort of talk about how these issues start to link, and how it becomes harder to sort of deal with them all separately. So I know Pittsburgh did not deal in the same way that other cities did with the foreclosure crisis, but this was a national phenomenon that wiped out about 50% of Black wealth nationally. I actually, unfortunately, do not have the numbers of how it eradicated Latino wealth, but I assume that it's similar in number. Home values in Black communities have fallen by 41%, as compared to white communities at about 20%. So just double the impact. I mean, and at some point I think we have to start saying, when we see these same patterns represented, saying that it's disparate impact like it's an accident, and sort of say, is it the system keeps being designed to produce these same results? It's not about the people being evil, but at some point we have to say, if we see the same thing happening over and over again, and your behaviors are producing the same thing and you do nothing to change it, at some point we have to say, well, then you are responsible, right? That is you. So foreclosures happen, it displaces folks, right? Higher rents and banks buying up properties displace folks. And what we're seeing both here in the United States, but also this is a global phenomenon. I kept looking for another synonym for a slum, and I just feel like, well, why? We should just be honest with what is being created. This is globally happening, that there's higher and higher concentrations of poverty in and around cities. Here in the United States, we have a phenomenon that it's actually being moved out to the suburbs. So once in the 70s and 80s, it was the inner city, and now it is the rings and outer. And just to give sort of credence to this, between 2000 and 2013, if you look at the census tracts of areas that have where over 40% live below the poverty rate, the numbers of those areas that exist doubled in that period of time. So this is a growing phenomenon. And when you have a devaluation of housing stock and people are concentrated in areas of poverty, you have an issue with how schools get funded, right? So it creates another revolving crisis again, this is another, in terms of how this plays out with school privatization, we know how this round goes. So the schools don't have money. They cut services. Then, lo and behold, less money, lower performance in terms of the school's ability to educate the students it has. And now, because the public sector is just inefficient on its own, we got to bring in business to increase efficiencies, right? And this is sort of that same round robin that we've seen. This charter schools and the growth of this is a black and brown issue. Of the 50 school districts which are chartered, all but 8 are majority black and Latino. And I did teach school for a very short period of time, but there is just something in me that gets really angry when I hear about stories of charter school administrators talking about we need to increase discipline and sort of teach consequences to these kids. When I look at how private schools let kids get away with, there's a lot more openness of like we need to work with them and they're just being kids and kids will be kids, and we have a sort of like militaristic style of educating kids that look like me. Here in Pittsburgh, you have an issue where many of the private school population is overwhelmingly white. I don't know the exact history here, but normally when I see this, it follows patterns that you see in cities where the move to private school was a way to avoid school desegregation. So as another manner here. So, again, you can start to see this link of how you go from debt and how companies are thinking about short-term gains, where can we invest, what's turning quick profit, to things like subprime mortgages that then relate to displacement and people being moved out, right? To then, or on the flip side of what we've seen now is, you're seeing a new bubble being increased with companies like Blackstone Group, which is now the private equity firm, largest single family home owner in the country. And we're seeing companies like that securitize rental properties. So they're bundling them and turning them into securities that can be sold off and using the mortgages as collateral. So both prices are getting inflated, and you sort of look in and go, what could go wrong? Like we didn't remember 2007 and 2008. So I'm going to skip ahead a little bit here. And this same sort of cycle is what got us to the situation here with Pittsburgh and the lead in the water here, where the water district was convinced to enter into bad, toxic rate swaps. They saddled the authority with debt, then which precipitated bringing in a private contractor that was private management firm that was then given license that if you save money, half of it you get to keep. Well, what does that incentivize? Cutting corners. And those corners were cut at the risk of health of the residents and especially the kids of this city. So what do? I think the point here is that no one policy campaign, no one issue is going to tackle all this. It is great, and if you are feeling overwhelmed, then I have succeeded, because that's what I wanted to make the point, is that no one thing on its own is going to fix this, and so what we need to be thinking about is how do we take maximum use of the resources of our movement. That is both the money and the people and the talent and expertise that all of us have gained over time. And some of that's starting to look at the intersections here, right? If I go back to my example of Blackstone, I'm just wanting to point out because I think they're a prime example. You have them as, in many cities, premier owner of office towers. They used to be the premier hotelier with Hilton. They're now the biggest landlord of single-family rental properties in the country, and they're raising $100 billion to start buying off infrastructure. So, rather than all of us sort of going at and jousting at the dragon on our own and trying to see, maybe we can get there, maybe it's about time that we start to think about how do we come together and think about ways in which we can fight on jobs, fight on housing, fight on how infrastructure is built. Is it community driven? Is it a community wealth builder? Or is it something that's going to extract together? And that is a lot of the work here that Pittsburgh United has been leading. And even more so in this moment, how do we think about doing this even bigger and even better than it's been done before, and really looking at these intersections at who is behind the curtain and who is driving on multiple fronts many of the problems that we see. So as I have been here sort of talking about, well, we need to go after people, we need to be very technical and think about research and everything. I don't want to abandon that we also need to have a vision. And I will also say this is that I have been guilty of doing this as an organizer, where I have talked to folks and door knocked and home visited and only talked about a single issue or a single problem. And maybe that works for a period of time, but at the end of the day, it is not a real, full, uncompromising vision of what is the city we want to be in, what is the town, what is the state that is deserving of all the talent and all the humanity and all the richness that the residents here have to offer, right? And I feel that right now, especially looking at the events of November of last year, people know what I'm talking about, that the other side has a narrative and they have a story. They have a narrative of how we got here. They have a story of who's responsible. And it's not the people I was talking about before, right? And they certainly have a vision that does not include many of us in this room. And we must, at this moment, equally embrace and be unafraid to be labeled unrealistic, crazy, dreamers, because it's what is needed in this moment is for people to have hope and to be able to embrace what is at the end of the day, if I'm fighting on minimum wage today, how does that lead to the kind of job that I really should have? Because I think for those of us in labor, we know, yes, wages are important, but it's not the only thing that workers care about, right? I mean, a resident in a neighborhood, a quality home or a rent stabilized home is important, but it's not the only issue. I'm speeding along. I did include this to talk about, and that was sort of the inspiration for calling this Constructing the Beloved City, was to harken back to Dr. King, who I think was, one of the best organizers that we have had in the last 100 years or so in this country. And he really embraced this idea that we must build, and that this wasn't sort of pie in the sky, that this was a real thing that could be achieved, that we can build and construct a community in which poverty, racism, and militarism are so abhorrent to human decency that the society would never allow them to occur. And that is what I sort of want to speak to today, is that we need to point at who's really to blame and really sort of put our work to extracting what we need from them and wresting power away. But we also need to embrace and point towards and say that it really there can be a Pittsburgh in which everybody has shelter and quality shelter. And that work is not just about going and getting 15 or 16 or 20, but it's also about having meaning and community and value and having that work respected by the people around you. That we can have clean environment and all that means, from the water that we drink to the air that we breathe to seeing beautiful trees and landscape around us. I'm over time, so I'm going to keep skipping forward. So it is just, I do want to lift up that a lot of the work that is being led here, that is happening across the country, where we have housing groups, labor groups, community organizations, environmental justice groups coming together and looking for ways to come together, is really the right direction here. And I do really want to speak to the funders in the room. We need to fund organizing. Because one of the things that we are seeing with those in power that are seeking to use hate is that they thrive on despair and loneliness. And organizing is totally about hope and community. And so it is the biggest opportunity we have to move past this period and put it behind us and say, woo, we came close, but we are doing something we never imagined we could do. And so I want to close with another, I think amazing organizer, Harvey Milk, who said, "Hope will never be silent." And that is what is, we were in my little small group, we were talking about how do we sustain people. And I think that is, once you hope, once you think about the city that we deserve, the city that our kids deserve, the city I want to live in, and you have that vision, you can't unthink it again. Can't unsee it. You can't unwant it. And so I just leave folks tonight with hoping that we all go out and ignite that in our communities and think about how do we think about coming together and pulling our resources again together to win the most inclusive, best, and amazing cities that we can, and really embrace the most inclusive we the people that we can imagine. And that's it.